Dota 2 is one of the most competitive games in the world, in large part due to its revolutionarily huge prize pools. In an environment where winning a single tournament can make a player into a millionaire, only the best strategies and strongest heroes get chosen for the stage. Performing at an international is one of the most difficult things a Dota hero can do. Nonetheless, a few characters have spent the last 12 years distinguishing themselves from the rest of the cast, either through high pick rates or by dominating a competition. At TI, Leshrac is the 5th most contested Dota hero of all time, which poses an important question. Did Leshrac deserve to spend that much time in the spotlight, or should he never have gone mainstream? Today we will journey through Dota 2 history and deconstruct his story and performance at the most important Dota events, the International Tournament Series. So, how good was Leshrac, the tormented soul? Leshrac joined Dota 2 during the close beta period before the first international. He was a ranged intelligence hero whose natural attributes stood out because of his unusually low strength and as a result low health and his above-average movement speed. Leshrac also had high intelligence, which gave him a highly necessary sturdy mana pool as all of his spells were mana-intensive. His first ability was Split Earth. Split Earth allowed Leshrac to target an AoE up to 750 units away. After a short delay, all enemies in that AoE would be stunned for 2 seconds and take significant magic damage. Split Earth had a fairly low cooldown of only 9 seconds, but it came with a steep mana cost. Because of its inbuilt delay, this ability was difficult to hit when used by itself and usually required some sort of setup, either by using an item like Yule's Scepter of Divinity or having an ally stun or slow the target before using Split Earth. However, this was a minor setback, as due to its long range and low cooldown, Split Earth was still an excellent spell. Leshrac's second ability was Diabolic Edict. For a high mana cost, Diabolic Edict created a field surrounding Leshrac that traveled with him as he moved, and that did damage to nearby enemy units and buildings. This field lasted up to 8 seconds, dealing up to 50 damage 4 times per second, which meant it could deal up to 1600 damage total. Diabolic Edict could only deal damage to one enemy at a time, and it would choose its targets randomly among all available options. This meant that the ability would split its damage on all enemy units in the area. If Leshrac managed to isolate an opponent, then he could deal huge amounts of damage even very early in the game. But they had the option of hiding in lane creeps or jungle camps to mitigate it. On the other hand, literally hiding was very difficult when going up against Diabolic Edict, as the explosions would show Leshrac where his opponents were, even if they were invisible. Edict had no cast time, meaning it came out instantly when the ability was clicked. Diabolic Edict also did damage to towers. This was a very unique property and incredibly useful, as it burned through them quickly if there were no other units nearby to absorb the hits. This gave Leshrac a significant pushing presence, as towers had no magic resistance and were simply immune to most spells. Composite damage equated to physical damage when interacting with towers, which made Diabolic Edict very good at breaking through them. Another of Diabolic Edict's weird properties was that it would continue for its full duration even if Leshrac died. In that case, the ability would linger wherever Leshrac had been killed and deal its remaining damage there. His third ability was Lightning Storm. Lightning Storm dealt magic damage to a target, then it would jump to other nearby enemy units and deal damage to them too. This ability dealt fairly middling damage and had a high mana cost, but also a low cooldown of only 5.5 seconds. which made it spammable and a good source of additional damage output in extended fights, as long as Leshrac had enough mana for it. Leshrac's ultimate was Pulse Nova. Pulse Nova was a toggled ability with no cooldown that cost 110 mana to activate and then additional mana for every second it was active. While active, Pulse Nova dealt damage to all units in a 400 radius around Leshrac. Pulse Nova wouldn't deactivate on its own unless Leshrac ran out of mana. It will continue to deal its damage even if Leshrac got stunned or silenced. Unfortunately, the mana upkeep cost combined with the high initial mana cost to activate Pulse Nova made it an inefficient tool for dealing damage, particularly when keeping in mind that Leshrac already used a lot of mana for all of his other abilities. Another problem the ability faced was that it didn't deal damage to ancient creeps, Roshan, and creep heroes like Lone Druid's Spirit Bear. Pulse Nova also had an Aghanim Scepter upgrade that simply increased its damage output. Before we continue on, please allow me a small moment for a tangent. The complete disregard for patterns in the Leshrac numbers kills my soul a little bit. Split Earth's mana cost went from 100 to 125 to 140 to 160. Why the additional 5 on the second level? Similarly, Edict scaled from 95 to 120 to 135 to 155. Now you might think that this was just a weird aesthetic quirk of Leshrac. But no, Lightning Storm immediately broke the pattern and scaled a nice 15 points of mana per level. However, it did also scale in jumps from 4 to 6 to 7 to 8, and its damage went from 80 to 145 to 205 to 265, both of which are completely new patterns. Why? Okay, tangent over, I'm sorry, I just couldn't leave this unmentioned. Overall, Leshrac was a fairly simple hero that brought many valuable elements to the table, but also had clear weaknesses. He had a strong stun, but he needed help to properly connect with it. He was uniquely good at pushing, but there was clear counterplay available. And while his total damage was very high, he also needed a lot of mana for all of his abilities. Using Leshrac required an understanding of his strengths, but also of his limitations. The International one was unique. None of the participating teams had a lot of time to practice Dota 2 before the actual tournament, and the game itself was also still unfinished. A significant portion of the hero pool from Warcraft 3 Dota hadn't been ported to Dota 2 yet, making the selection of available characters small. Aside from that, a major difference to modern Dota was that there were fewer resources available to all players. For example, at the time, each side only had access to 6 creep camps, as opposed to today's 13. Elements like bounty or wisdom runes also didn't exist. There simply wasn't as much money on the map. Within this environment, the players tended to favor tri-lane team compositions. This usually meant a strong late-game carry in the safe lane, protected by 2 supports, then a mid laner that could apply pressure, and finally an off-laner that prioritized survival. Leshrac had no defensive abilities, so he wasn't ever used as an off-laner. Players at the time also didn't consider him a good fit for the carry or mid role. This left him only one of the 2 supporting duties. However, because of his high mana costs, he did need some items at least. Split Earth and Lightning Storm had low enough cooldowns that Leshrac could use them multiple times in a fight, as long as he had enough mana. Arcane Boots and Magic Wand were required, as without them, he would run out of resources too quickly to continue casting his spells. Leshrac also liked tanking up a bit. A few bracers for additional health went a long way, and a BKB for spell immunity was valuable. Considering his need for items, he couldn't take on a position 5 support role that bought wards, as they cost 200 gold each, and hence the position 5 support often ended their game with only brown boots and magic wand as their full inventory. And so, as a matter of exclusion, Leshrac was played as a position 4 support, focused on protecting his mid and safe laner while also trying to find bits and pieces of farm wherever he could. He was usually paired with heroes like Vengeful Spirit or Earthshaker that had reliable long-range stuns to set up for Split Earth. A double stun combo like this made for really easy early aggression. Leshrac often roamed the map, searching for opportunities. These varied from game to game, and what he found dictated his skill build. Split Earth was always leveled at least once, but from here it varied. Sometimes Leshrac maxed out Split Earth and Lightning Storm for consistent single target damage. Other times he wanted to push, and so he opted for early levels of Diabolic Edict to help with breaking down towers. When doing so, he could then level up Lightning Storm secondarily to truly maximize his damage, or he could continue leveling Split Earth to optimize his mana usage. One consistent and quite unusual element of his skill build was that Leshrac players nearly always skipped Post Nova until they had maxed out all of their other spells. This was because of its enormous mana cost. Post Nova's damage was solid, but it burned through his mana pools so quickly that it prevented Leshrac from casting his other, individually more powerful spells, which wasn't a trade worth taking. At TI1, Leshrac was primarily treated as a stunner. Teams picked him for Split Earth. Anything else he brought to the table was just a bonus. There was definitely a bit of tunnel visioning going on. At the time, Dota didn't have a lot of heroes with good stuns, so that became what made Leshrac valuable. Unfortunately for him, the other stunners like Earthshaker, Windranger and Vengeful Spirits were favorites, and so he often saw his role already filled by them. When he was picked, he was also usually paired with those more reliable disablers, making him backup for the backup. Another issue he faced was that Anti-Mage had an ever-present impact on TI1 as the undisputed strongest hero of the tournament, and Leshrac had no way of being effective against him. As the name implies, Anti-Mage was excellent against spellcasters. Specifically, he would burn their mana, and as Leshrac was already always struggling to have enough of it, this was a big problem for him. Overall, Leshrac was contested in 12 games. This wasn't as bad as it sounds. TI1 only had 52 matches total. Out of the 9 games he played, he won 5 of them, which was a perfectly good performance. Still, it felt like the teams at the time didn't quite know what to do with him. They wanted him for his stun, but they didn't really pay attention to everything else he could bring to the party. Leshrac knew he was better. He could do more. But for now, he was content in his role and waited for his time to shine. Patch 6.73 brought some minor changes to Leshrac, increasing the radius of Post Nova by 50 and his movement speed by 5. More importantly, after TI1, Dota 2 opened its gates and invited many new heroes and players to join. This transformed the environment of the game fundamentally. Pro players could actually practice against pro players now, and they would do so with a much larger ensemble of heroes. The next TI was said to have more players, more games, and more heroes than ever. It was the opportunity our ambitious upstart had been waiting for. The International 2 was about pushing. Towers were worth a lot of money, and among others, the addition of Lycan, Lone Druid, and Broodmother made it possible for teams to claim this money early and aggressively. The previously passive tri-lanes changed their approach and focused on breaking down the tower in their lane as quickly as possible, which then freed up their supports to move and apply pressure in other places on the map. Depending on the carry, they would either join them in their pushing efforts or use the resources gained through those early tower kills to accelerate their farming in the jungle. Within this new environment, Leshrac thrived. The understanding of him shifted entirely. He was no longer a stunner with added utility, but he became a pusher that was also a stunner. Leshrac offered roll compression of two incredibly valuable elements. His skill build shifted to accommodate that and became entirely about Split Earth and Diabolic Edict, with Edict taking priority. He only skilled his ultimate at level 9 after his other two abilities were maxed out, which also meant that Lightning Storm wasn't chosen until quite late into the game. This adjustment in skill build helped address one of Leshrac's biggest problems, his high mana costs. By going for a quality over quantity approach, he could do more with the mana he had, and he could even use Post Nova effectively as he wasn't wasting his mana on Lightning Storm. Split Earth was also often easy to use due to the other popular heroes at the time. Rubik, Naga Siren and Tidehunter all offered easy ways to set up for the stun. Like before, Leshrac was mostly played as a support, but he also saw frequent use as a safe lane carry and occasionally even found himself in the mid. No matter where he went, Leshrac had one goal and one goal only: use Diabolic Edict to push. To get a better impression of how this worked in practice, let's have a closer look at Game 2 of the Grand Finals of the International 2012, Na'Vi vs IG. Here we see Leshrac played by Arsaard from Na'Vi. Ravost and Arsaard kick off the game with a quick net into Split Earth to secure first blood. Early laning goes quietly, as Leshrac completely denies Broodmother access to the creep wave. By positioning himself between her and the creeps, she can't approach, as any misstep will result in a net, in a stun, in Edict tearing her limb from limb. It doesn't take too long for Na'Vi to force the issue, and they quickly take the top tower. IG responds in kind in the bottom lane. Arsaard then moves into the mid, joining Dragon Knight for a quick kill on Templar Assassin. Then it's time for a trip back home for some refreshments. When played as a support, Leshrac's mana costs required him to march back home every once in a while. In the meantime, the Radiant has moved the party to the top lane. They want a tower kill. Na'Vi challenges them. Arsaard lands a beautiful stun on two heroes, but is then targeted down and killed. Nonetheless, he has already done his job. Na'Vi cleans up from here. A few smaller skirmishes happen in the mid, moving back and forth until the dire mid tower goes down. Then IG goes top again. They want to finally take that tower. But Arsaard is always around. His focus is on protecting his team and being ready to fight. The full Na'Vi squad is too intimidating for IG and they back off. But Na'Vi grouped up to fight, so they'll bring the music themselves if that's what it takes.
I think Na'Vi right now is fine, and they do sense that as well. They want to just push. This tier 2 is so important. They're diving past Dragon Knight. We talked about the Dragon Tail, the initiation range. Faith, he's dead. He's gonna try to stun some and blows the Laguna Blade. No! He gets back. The Dragon Flames won't get him. And now the tier 2 in big trouble. You can see that Chuan on the right side trying to set something up. Dendy is nuked down. Fable, telekinesis. Oh, he still has the dragon form. No, it is gonna be the sleep. And now they're coming right back. The vacuum on everybody. Everybody's dying right now. Team wipe against IG. Na'Vi in game 2. They're holding on, and they're gonna take another tower.
Na'Vi.
After the fight, Leshrac turns up Diabolic Edict, and with its power, combined with the rest of their summons, Na'Vi takes a 15-minute barracks before retreating, regrouping, and edicting the first tower bottom. Then the second. Leshrac strongly enhances Na'Vi's push, because he offers both wave clear with his Split Earth and pushing power with Edict. IG's base is next.
Surge into a Naga Siren ultimate if they want to use it. Not using it yet, but at a moment's notice, it could go out. Chuan steals Riptide. Really not what you want because you don't have those illusions. Surgeon, Dendy, not going to go. Excuse me, not Surgeon, just Haste. It's still telekinesis, pointing back. The Light Strike Array, it will connect, but Puppy is here. He should be okay. There's your song. Vacuum in. Wombo combo!
One dead. 2 dead. Hannafra comes in right now. The third's going to be coming very, very soon for Rory and Brood running away. Volts has net soon. He finds Ferrari. Ferrari's dead. And now the Raxus. Oh, how did Leshrac die? It doesn't matter at this point though. That's the Raxus.
No, Lumi, it does matter. Leshrac died after hitting stuns on 3 different heroes and dealing significant damage to Lina, enabling Na'Vi to crush the teamfight and win the game. Leshrac's excellent roll compression of a stunner and a pusher allowed Na'Vi to get the most out of their opportunities in fights. And afterwards, lots of heroes could help win a fight, but not many were able to immediately leverage any slight advantage into massive pushes that could be game-ending in the right circumstances. Diabolic Edict had a 22 seconds cooldown. Creep waves spawned every 30 seconds. With every creep wave cycle, Leshrac could use his powerful AoE to clear the opposing creeps, then use Diabolic Edict to apply incredible tower pressure that needed to be dealt with. Leshrac had a fantastic rhythm to his pushes. This worked particularly well when Leshrac was used as a carry. His supports could help clear the wave, and then he crushed the towers. Carry Leshrac was usually played alongside a more farming-orientated mid like Morphling that would be able to benefit from the money Leshrac's pushes generated, as unfortunately Leshrac himself didn't have a great item build available to him. Bloodstone was his strongest option. Bloodstone was an item that provided health and mana and had a passive effect that allowed it to build up charges whenever an opponent died in a radius around its carrier. Each charge provided mana regeneration and made it so that when the hero carrying Bloodstone died, they would consume half of the item's charges to heal all nearby allies for an impactful amount of health while reducing their own respawn time and gold lost significantly. They would also leave behind a mark on the ground that provided vision and allowed the hero to continue gaining experience in the area until they respawned. Bloodstone was a great fit for Leshrac, as his playstyle often guided him right into the middle of the action. He needed to be next to opponents to deal damage with Diabolic Edict and Pulse Nova, and because he was dangerous if left alive during or after the fight, he was frequently targeted down early. This was true no matter if Leshrac was a core or a support, which is also why his ultimate started seeing more play. Pulse Nova burned through his mana pool incredibly quickly, but with Leshrac, mana equaled damage, and if he was going to get targeted down anyway, he might as well use all of his mana before getting knocked out. Now, Leshrac wasn't flawless. His high mana cost still required active, constant consideration. Anti-Mage also remained a popular pick and had an easy time preying on him. Finally, he didn't have access to great items. Past Bloodstone and BKB, there wasn't much for him to buy. Aghanim Scepter wasn't a terrible option, but also not particularly exciting. However, in the grand scheme, those weren't a lot of weaknesses. Leshrac was an amazing hero at TI2. His pushing power and roll compression made him one of the most valuable and popular characters of the entire tournament. Still, a few other heroes could actually push faster and scale better into the late game than he did. Lycan and Naga Siren in particular would have competed for spots on teams with him, if only they weren't always banned. And since bans had to be used on them, that meant Leshrac was often free to be picked. He was not only the third most contested hero of the tournament at 149 games, but he was also the single most picked hero of TI2, being chosen in 91 games with a fantastic 55% win rate. Leshrac was the standout support of the International 2012, and in fights he shone brighter than many cores. This was his breakout performance. He had engraved himself into the competitive Dota 2 scene, and he liked it. The only change Leshrac received between TI1 and 3 was a slight nerf to Edict, which gained a short cast animation as opposed to the instant cast it was before. The International 2013 had a fundamentally different meta from the previous year. Many of the powerful pushing heroes had fallen out of fashion, and the best team of the tournament, Alliance, pioneered a much more defensive playstyle that was quickly adopted by the other teams. Slow, farming-based compositions dominated the field, resulting in games going past 40 minutes with single-digit kill counts. Pushing early towers was still valued, but only as long as it came with little risk. It wasn't uncommon for a push that encountered any sort of resistance to quickly back off. This made Leshrac's approach of aggressively following through on fights and pushes undesirable. When Leshrac was played, he was used exclusively as a support. His skill build went back to the varied style we saw at TI1, and more emphasis was put on split earth again. He reverted to being nothing but a stunner. That is for all teams except for one. Tong Fu stuck to the TI2 style of picking Leshrac for Diabolic Edict and leading the charge for him so that he could take down buildings. By pairing him with a support that helped set up his stun, Tong Fu still got huge value out of Split Earth, and the early pushes enabled Leshrac to purchase enough mana to use Pulse Nova and Lightning Storm. In particular, they liked pairing him with Shadow Demon, who could also enhance his damage output and protect him when they got in trouble. This approach worked great for them, and they won every single game they played Leshrac in. Unfortunately for Leshrac, they were the only team to win any games with him. Overall, Leshrac was contested in 21 games and picked 11 times. Out of those 11 matches, he only won the 4 games that Tong Fu played him in. In my opinion, what made Tong Fu different was that they had a stronger idea of what they wanted from Leshrac. They didn't pick him just because they needed a stun. They understood that he wasn't the best choice if that's all a draft needed. His lack of defensive utility meant that other stunners lasted longer in fights than he could, which gave them more long-term value. But they also understood that he had unique properties that were precious if used correctly. Leshrac didn't see much success at TI3, but that was because most teams weren't playing to his unique style. After his somewhat disappointing performance at TI3, Leshrac received a few more changes. Both Pulse Nova and its Aghanim Scepter upgrade had their damage increased by a good amount. Also, Lightning Storm had its jump count reduced to a nice pattern of 4, 5, 6, 7, and its damage normalized to a growth of 60 per level. Thank you. More importantly, its cooldown and mana cost were reduced, and it now applied a powerful slow for a brief moment. At the International 2014, Leshrac started experimenting with the aforementioned Lightning Storm boss. While he remained in a support role, his players would skip Edict and instead focused on the magical burst damage Leshrac could offer. Edict has always had the problem of being a bit unpredictable. Its damage was severely hindered if unintended targets got into its radius. The Lightning Storm build was able to put out more targeted damage, without giving opponents as much of an opportunity to play around it. To Leshrac's disappointment, it used way too much mana to be a sustainable option for his support. He would deplete himself quickly and then be left attacking weakly. The build also didn't fit into the evolving meta of the tournament. How Dota was played changed drastically from the beginning of TI4 to its finals. The first few days still felt familiar, with teams putting emphasis on playing defensive tri-lanes and farming up their carries before they went for any larger plays. But then, 2 teams realized something weird. Towers were worth an absurd amount of money. A team could sustain their entire economy and easily surpass regular farming strategies just as long as they were rapidly breaking down buildings. While there were only a limited number of towers on the map, all these 2 teams needed to do to avoid burning themselves out was to win the game. Those 2 teams were Newbie and VG Gaming. They changed the meta of the entire tournament by letting go of the traditional idea of a carry and instead focused on picking heroes with powerful ultimates and pushing potential, which they then used to end games in 15 minutes or less. This hyper-aggressive playstyle required defensive counterpush to work, as it was crucial that the defending team wasn't able to answer the push by taking towers themselves, since that would negate the advantage earned. Leshrac's Diabolic Edict build slotted into this new style perfectly. He could creep clear and he could push early. VG Gaming also often paired him with Shadow Demon again, which greatly enhanced his strengths and early burst potential. However, should Leshrac be on the receiving end of an aggressive push, then he couldn't offer a lot to counter tower pressures from heroes like Death Prophet, Shadow Shaman or Razor, who mostly relied on big ultimates and hence built very tanky. Diabolic Edict was also ineffective against summon or illusion-based heroes. In those moments, he would be forced into the Lightning Storm build, which wasn't great. This left Leshrac in a really weird spot in the meta, where he was both amazing and terrible. His Lightning Storm build had a 0% win rate, while the Diabolic Edict build had a 100% win rate. As teams were catching on to this, Leshrac morphed from mostly Lightning Storm at the beginning of the tournament to only Diabolic Edict by the end. Overall, the International 4 was a polarizing tournament for Leshrac. He definitely had a noteworthy presence towards the end of the event, and his overall win rate was a great 66%. But his pick rate was fairly low, as it was only contested in 15 games. Yet still, the majority of those picks came from the team that ultimately placed second. Leshrac was strong and should probably have seen more play than he did. Setting his performance aside, this tournament also marked the starting point of a more dedicated effort to make Lightning Storm builds work, although the ability was still coming slightly short. Up to this point in Dota's history, the game had gone only through slight changes. Patches were mostly restricted to number updates and the addition of new characters. However, TI4 was received badly in the community and is to this day often regarded as a low point. It was in the aftermath of this tournament that Dota 2 saw its first major system rework. Towers had their bounties vastly reduced, and in their place came reworked gold mechanics that made hero kills much more valuable. Bounty runes were also added into the game and provided an additional way to earn money, as well as making the mid lane a more consistent experience that was less influenced by getting lucky with rune pickups. 6.84 also introduced a huge set of new items into the game. Out of those, the one that mattered the most to Leshrac was Octarine Core. Octarine Core was built using a Mystic Staff and a Soul Booster. It provided health, mana, intelligence, and regeneration. Most importantly, it introduced two new elements into Dota 2, Spell Lifesteal and Cooldown Reduction, of which it offered 25% each. Octarine Core was the first item introduced into Dota 2 that allowed casters to directly increase the potency of their spells. While it was expensive, it presented an additional late-game option for a class of heroes that had up to this point always petered off as a game went late. Bloodstone also saw some changes. The first was actually implemented shortly after the International 2013, but it hadn't been relevant up until now. This change gave Bloodstone the pocket deny ability that instantly killed the user. As the name implies, this death was a deny, and hence wouldn't give opponents any gold or experience. While killing yourself may not sound all that useful, this ability was less about dying and more about preventing opponents from getting kills. Pocket Deny was incredibly good at this, as the ability came out instantly and without any delay or cast point, which meant it could even be used in the most dire, time-sensitive situations. In addition to this, Bloodstone had its recipe reworked. The new build-up required a Soul Ring and a Soul Booster, as well as 900 gold. Soul Ring was an amazing addition to Bloodstone. It was a cheap item that provided some health and mana regeneration and had an active ability that could be used to take 150 damage to gain 150 temporary mana. This temporary mana had to be used within 10 seconds, else it would be lost. Soul Ring was an incredibly powerful item for heroes that needed a lot of mana quickly, but it often lost its usefulness past the early stages as it took up an inventory slot while not providing any significant stats. The Bloodstone rework allowed players to purchase Soul Ring for the early game benefits it offered, and then let them effectively use it as a cost reduction for a much more powerful mana boosting item. Bloodstone's other component, Soul Booster, was a simple boost to health and mana, although with a nice build-up. It contained an energy booster that could be temporarily used for arcane boots before being disassembled and combined into the Bloodstone. On top of all of that, Bloodstone was also made significantly cheaper in total cost, although the inclusion of Soul Ring made it feel much cheaper. Another important environmental change was the Mud Golem jungle creeps losing their signature magic immunity. Up to this point, this creep camp had been fully magic immune. Characters that relied on magic damage had no good method of killing a Mud Golem, which made clearing jungle stacks of medium camps a surprisingly difficult hurdle to clear. 6.84 removed the magic immunity from Mud Golems and made it possible for characters like Leshrac to clear jungle stacks of medium camps. Leshrac himself was also buffed in a variety of ways. Pulse Nova had its damage increased again and its activation mana cost lowered. It also became capable of dealing damage to Ancient Creeps, Roshan, and Creep heroes. Diabolic Edict had its damage type changed from composite to physical. Its damage was lower to make up for this buff, but it now also dealt 40% bonus damage to towers. These changes are a bit technical, but just know that Edict was buffed, especially since its duration and maximum number of explosions were also increased by 25%. Lightning Storm was also continuing its evolution. Its cast range was increased to an incredible 800. Its cast point was slightly reduced and its slow duration was increased. Finally, Leshrac's movement speed was buffed by 5. When the doors for this year's tour opened for the first time, Leshrac could not believe his eyes or ears, as a vast, deafening crowd had gathered in front of him, and their cheers could be heard miles away. At the International 2015, Leshrac was picked 18 times. At the International 2015, Leshrac was the best. The mid lane was his menu, Lightning Storm his instrument. It was an easily castable nuke that did good damage on a very low cooldown. The slow it applied and its fast cast speed allowed Leshrac to chain it into Split Earth stuns, which quickly opened up kill opportunities. This was particularly effective because of Lightning Storm's 800 cast range, which easily outranged every relevant hero in the game. Combined with its massive 650 bounce radius, the ability was unavoidable during the laning stage. Anytime a hero approached the creep wave, Leshrac could cast Lightning Storm either on the creeps or on the hero themselves, and it was guaranteed to hit. Leshrac could also use it to last hit creeps from distances or positions that he wouldn't otherwise have been able to attack from, and anytime he did, it came with free pressure on the opposing hero. Because, and this is worth repeating, 800 cast range and 650 bounce range outranged every relevant hero in the game and made Lightning Storm impossible to avoid. What I'm about to say, I don't say carelessly, so please understand it with all the gravitas I intend. Lightning Storm was overpowered. It made Leshrac unbeatable in the mid lane, as long as he had mana. But that long-standing problem had been solved by the recent changes to Bloodstone. By incorporating Soul Ring into an early item core of Magic Wand, Bottle and Arcane Boots, Leshrac had access to all the mana he needed to quickly farm a Bloodstone and then be set for the rest of the game. Bottle in particular had become a much more reliable tool than it had been because of the addition of bounty runes. Dedicated mid laners like Leshrac would also use a technique called bottle ferrying to supply themselves with even more health and mana. After using bottle charges to heal, there were two main ways to refill them. Players could either pick up a rune or go back to the fountain. However, it wasn't important who went back to the fountain with the bottle. It could be an allied hero or even a courier. That's where bottle ferrying came into play. The mid player would use up all of their bottle charges and then put the empty item onto their team's courier. The courier went back to the base, which refilled the bottle and then delivered it back to its owner. Bottle ferrying was a cornerstone of the mid lane for many years, and going forward, assume that bottle ferrying is happening unless stated otherwise. With all of this mana available to him, Leshrac went through the game by first winning the mid lane with ease, and then went into the jungle to farm up his Bloodstone. Stacking and farming the jungle was crucially important at the International 5. Since over the previous year, towers had their bounties reduced, the jungle was the main knob the supports could turn to help their carries outfarm their opponents. It was common practice for teams to have one of their supports dedicated to mostly being in the jungle, stacking. Then, after the jungle was stacked, it needed to be cleared. The best way to do so was with big AoE spell damage, and that was Leshrac's specialty. His skill build changed slightly to accommodate that, maxing out Lightning Storm first and Split Earth second, and now, finally, including his ultimate at level 6. Using all 3 of his AoE magic damage nukes, Leshrac became one of the quickest farmers in the game. It took him no time to finish his Bloodstone, and as soon as he did, it was time to turn up the tempo and start fighting. Due to the cost-effective nature of the Bloodstone recipe, Leshrac could purchase it long before anyone was able to acquire significant magic resistance, bonus health, or spell immunity. Split Earth, Lightning Storm, and Pulse Nova all were high magic damage, spammable abilities that easily overwhelmed anyone in early fights. And once Leshrac started getting kills, he started snowballing. Kills meant stacks on Bloodstone, stacks on Bloodstone meant more mana, mana meant more farming speed meant more items, and more items meant more kills. Pulse Nova was a fantastic carry ability. It did huge damage and had no cooldown. It always continued, even if Leshrac was stunned. It let him scale mana directly into power. His item build played into this. After Bloodstone, the most common option was Yule's Scepter of Divinity, an item that made either an opponent or its carrier invincible for 3 seconds, during which they were also stunned. Leshrac could use this to either set up for Split Earth stuns or to protect himself while continuing to deal damage with Pulse Nova. Yule's also provided additional mana and movement speed, which were all Leshrac needed to maintain his farming rhythm. From here, it was either a Black King bar for spell immunity or Boots of Travel, which gave Leshrac a global presence by letting him teleport to creeps. This worked particularly well with Bloodstone. Keep in mind that it reduced respawn times based on its number of stacks, and due to Leshrac's overwhelming presence, he often reached high stack counts rapidly. An entirely real possibility was Leshrac dropping low in a fight, denying himself with the Pocket Deny, instantly respawning due to Bloodstone stacks, and then teleporting right back into the action with his Boots of Travel. Even death couldn't slow him down. But from his opponent's perspective, he really needed to die. The longer a fight went on, the more damage he could do, and if he survived, then Diabolic Edict destroyed any structures he could get near to. While before, when played as a support, Leshrac always had to choose between Lightning Storm and Diabolic Edict. Now that he was played in the mid, in a farming position, he didn't have to worry about that anymore. It wasn't difficult for him to get the levels needed to have access to all of his abilities and get all of their benefits. Leshrac was the star of TI5. Every team feared him. In every single game that he was picked, he was chosen at the earliest possible moment. At the International 2015, Leshrac was picked 18 times. And he was banned in the remaining 145 games, giving him a 100% contest rate. There was not a single game without Leshrac. He was far and beyond the best hero in all of Dota 2. There were no true counters, although various attempts were made. Anti-Mage could theoretically fight into him in the later stages of a match, but Leshrac had a tendency of closing games out quickly, which didn't give Anti-Mage the time he needed to become powerful. This is also why Octarine Core wasn't as popular on Leshrac as expected, since he would win games too quickly to purchase an item that expensive. The most effective approach turned out to be aggressive early game pressure and high burst damage. Killing him early delayed his Bloodstone, and if his Bloodstone was delayed, he couldn't farm as well, which meant he wasn't as tanky as he wanted to be, and heroes like Lina or Queen of Pain could burst him down. But if the best counter to a hero is kill the hero, is that really a counter? Leshrac had finally found his moment and had become king. Ladies and gentlemen, and all of those in between and beyond, allow me to introduce you to tonight's main performance. CDEC Gaming vs Evil Geniuses at the International 2015. A story told in 3 parts. But first, let me tell you about the teams. CDEC Gaming was a young organization, freshly formed. Coming all the way from China, they had a difficult journey even making it to the International, only getting to join the tournament after winning the wild card qualifier. Evil Geniuses, on the other hand, were a foundational team of Dota 2 that had already played in the International as early as 2012. They placed 3rd in 2014 and were widely considered favorites going into TI5. Once the tournament started, CDEC quickly became known for their signature aggressive playstyle. They applied unrelenting pressure wherever they could and often relied on their main carry player Aggressive to lead the charge. This caught many teams off guard as they weren't ready for 5-on-5 confrontations as early and often as CDEC forced them. Just a few months before the tournament, EG had made some changes to their roster. Sumail and Aoi 2000 had joined their squad. The wunderkind Sumail had recently been discovered. He played the mid and was seemingly unbeatable. Even in the worst situations, he could miraculously pull out a victory. On the flip side, Aoi had been playing competitive Dota for a long time. He excelled in his role as a defensive, greedy support that enabled the rest of his team to perform during the laning stage and in fights. CDEC was all gas, no brakes. EG was restrained and calculating. The two teams met for the first time in the group stage. This first encounter did not go well for CDEC. Both games played out similarly. CDEC banned Leshrac and Naga Siren and then drafted their signature aggressive style. And EG responded by picking techies for Aoi 2000 and a strong mid laner for Sumail. Techies then restricted the space available for early movement severely, which gave Sumail all the time he needed to destroy the mid and snowball out of control. Despite their best efforts, CDEC couldn't attack EG the way they wanted to, and these games also made clear that Sumail was simply the stronger mid. EG won both games decisively. However, the two teams were destined to dance again. They shared the overall #1 placement in their group and were both invited to play in the upper bracket at the main event. It didn't take long for both to meet for the second time in the upper bracket finals. To avoid repeating the same mistakes they had made before, CDEC banned techies immediately in Game 1. They also removed Leshrac from the pool, as the prospect of Sumail playing him was terrifying. EG chose the now available Naga Siren right away. She was similar to techies, a support played by Aoi that let EG play defensively and take fights only on their own terms. Game 1 was a struggle for both teams, as CDEC had to work incredibly hard to break through EG's defensive line. But after 47 grueling minutes, CDEC managed to win a miracle fight and took the win. For Game 2, CDEC went all in on dealing with Aoi. They used both their early bans on Naga Siren and techies. Because CDEC had first pick, EG removed Leshrac from the pool. What followed was a 20-minute crescendo where EG had no moment to rest or even breathe. CDEC destroyed them and were the first to set foot into the grand finals. But EG wanted a rematch. They cleanly won the lower bracket finals, and then it was time for the decisive set. Game 1 started out familiar. CDEC had first pick, so they banned Techies and Naga Siren. EG decided to go with Darkseer and Bounty Hunter. They left Leshrac open. Naturally, CDEC first picked Leshrac right away. Both teams then finished their draft and assigned their players to their heroes. It immediately became obvious that something weird was happening. CDEC had given Leshrac not to Shiki, their mid player, but to Gowder, their support. Even more bizarrely, Gowder didn't seem particularly comfortable with the hero. First, he ganked the mid and missed a stun, then the top and missed again, then returned to the mid and again, nothing but air. For a team like CDEC, a team that relied on early momentum to overwhelm their opponents, these first 3 encounters were crucial, and missing those stuns already put them behind. While they wanted to keep up the aggression, they weren't able to while playing with a deficit, and EG made short work of them. The old dogs of Dota had used their time before the grand finals wisely and done some research on CDEC gaming. Game 2 started out in the exact same way. CDEC had first pick yet again, banned Naga Siren and Techies, and EG let Leshrac slide. Without much choice, CDEC picked him. This time they gave the hero to Shiki, but instead of playing mid, he went into the safe lane. There he was protected, but ultimately that wasn't what Leshrac was good for. The hero excelled at winning lanes. He was incredibly overwhelming in the mid. Still, CDEC stuck him in the safe lane and centered all of their efforts on their Queen of Pain and Broodmother instead. They managed to win the game relying on those 2 heroes, and Leshrac played only a tertiary role with little overall impact. So what was going on? Why was EG not banning Leshrac, and why didn't CDEC use the hero properly?
So someone just tweeted at me a stat that Shiki has 16 pop games with Leshrac over 4 years.
Okay.
That guy he does not play Leshrac mid.
Yeah.
It turned out that Shiki had never practiced Leshrac. CDEC didn't have a player that knew how to play the best hero in the game, and up to this point they had made their way into the grand finals by relying on him being banned in every single match. It had worked up to now, but when EG figured out their secret, they were left with no good options. They couldn't allow EG to pick Naga Siren, Techies, or Leshrac. Any of them would have been an insurmountable problem. EG knew this as well, and so they forced CDEC into using their own first pick as a 3rd ban. A ban that also gave them a hero they didn't know how to play. Game 3 was yet again a repeat of the previous 2. This time CDEC finally sent Leshrac into the mid, and after some initial laning struggles, he figured out his groove and actually played quite well in the early fights. However, as the game turned into a farming match, Shiki fell behind. He seemed unsure about what the right farming rotations for the hero were and how aggressively he could play with him. It took a while, but eventually EG earned a convincing victory. Heading into Game 4, CDEC realized they couldn't keep going like this. They elected to give EG first pick and then banned Techies and Leshrac. EG quickly opted for the now available Naga Siren, and 40 minutes later, evil geniuses were crowned champions of the International 5. At TI5, Leshrac was the best hero in the game. Only one other character could possibly have challenged his title, but we'll discuss who in a future video. The only time Leshrac was allowed to be picked was when the opposing team was absolutely confident they could deal with him. And CDEC's performance in the grand finals also dragged his statistics down. Despite this, he still reached a great 55% win rate. Leshrac's impact at the International 2015 was his second once-in-a-lifetime performance. He took dominion over the mid lane, crowned himself king, and proved that he deserved both. Thank you very much for watching our video so far. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up. If you really enjoyed it and you want to see the future upcoming videos, you can do so by becoming a channel member. That's also the best way to support us. It's like the most direct way to support us. Another thing we wanted to have quickly mentioned before we move on is that Stories of Dota will be participating in the short film contest for the International 2023. We will be uploading our entry in a few days, couple of days, not entirely sure when, but should be coming soon. And once it is available for vote in the client, we will also let you know. The short film contest is a popularity contest, so if you like our entry and it is available to vote for in the client, we would appreciate it if you could do that once it comes around. For now, let's get back to Leshrac. To nobody's surprise, Leshrac was heavily nerfed after these incredible results. His base damage was reduced by 4, a significant amount that severely impacted his ability to last hit during the laning stage. Lightning Storm had its bounce radius reduced from 650 to 475, which very deliberately missed several attack range thresholds and turned the ability from impossible to avoid to difficult to hit. Its damage was also significantly reduced. On top of that, among other items, infused raindrops were added into Dota 2. This item was a cheap consumable that provided a small amount of passive mana regeneration and had 5 charges. When its carrier took magic damage that exceeded 50, it would proc and absorb up to 120 of that. This would use one of its charges, and once all were used up, the item was destroyed. Infused raindrops were an incredible tool for dealing with early spell spammers like Leshrac had been at TI5. All this turned out to be overkill, as Leshrac wasn't picked or banned in a single game at the International 2016. If I may say so, this has to be one of the most severe overreactions to hero nerfs that I have ever seen. Leshrac undeniably lost a lot of what made him such a good mid laner, but the Edict support build was still possible. Despite that, in the few Leshrac matches of this time period that I found, he remained as a mid laner and consequently didn't do very well. TI5 had burned the idea of mid Leshrac into the collective brain cell of the player base, and as a result, Leshrac had vanished from the competitive scene. However, let's set this aside and talk about something much more important. As part of the International 6 Battle Pass, Leshrac received the greatest taunt of all time. After TI6 came patch 7.0, which introduced talents into Dota 2. Leshrac's first batch was lacking, and it was quickly updated to be much more powerful. 7.0 also included a redesign of the Dota map and introduced various additional creep camps. These presented additional resources, and a fast farming hero like Leshrac definitely benefited from their inclusion, particularly because ancient creeps also lost their magic immunity. Bounty runes were moved into their own location instead of spawning in the river. This meant that only one rune would spawn every rune cycle for the mid again, which made gathering those runes to refill the bottle more important. Alas, Leshrac wasn't the best at contesting rune spawns. Due to their random nature, players had to either guess and commit to being at a rune spawn location before the rune appeared and accept that 50% of the time they'll be in the wrong spot, or they had to wait until it appeared and then race towards it. Since Leshrac had no mobility spells, his only real option was guessing, which made his laning stage less consistent. Leshrac also had his movement speed and strength gain per level increased. With this movement speed change, Leshrac now had 325 starting movement speed, which was more than some heroes had with boots. While this wasn't quite the same as having a proper movement spell, if it came to sustained long-term movement, there were few heroes that could outrun Leshrac, which was particularly useful when moving between creep camps. Lightning Storm was also buffed with another cast point reduction and an increase in how many targets it could jump to. Finally, Pulse Nova had its damage increased again and gained a new Aghanim Scepter upgrade. With it, while Pulse Nova was active, every 1.75 seconds, Leshrac would automatically cast Lightning Storm on a random nearby enemy unit within a 750 radius. Lightning Storm cast this way prioritized heroes and would not bounce. Then it was time for the next tournament. At the International 2017, Leshrac saw no play again, except by one team. LGD Gaming brought him back as a mid. In this role, he was visibly weaker than he had been. A big problem Leshrac faced was how common dual mid lanes had become. 2-2-1 lineups or even 1-2-1 with a jungler were by no means unusual strategies. Since Leshrac was still playing centered around Diabolic Edict, going up against two heroes significantly reduced the threat he posed, since they could absorb the hits for each other and split the damage. Without early Lightning Storm, Leshrac was also lacking a way to set up for his own stun, and needed help again if he wanted to go for kills. Getting early kills was generally very difficult for him, as Diabolic Edict was an unreliable ability. To compensate for this lack of early game power, LGD always opted for multiple early game null talismans, which provided some cheap stats and made Leshrac a bit more difficult to fight into. This did slow down his early farming, but he already had a harder time snowballing than he used to, so the additional safety net was worth the investment. Leshrac then used his high natural movement speed to quickly clear the jungle and apply tower pressure wherever he could. Taking early towers was his way of catching up. While all of this probably makes Leshrac sound really bad, LGD was happy to use him mostly for his farming speed and late game presence. His early game may have been lackluster, but as long as he was given some time to recover, he could do so quickly. Then after he managed to purchase his items, Leshrac was a powerful hero that performed well in fights due to his fantastic damage output. His item build was still the same as before, except that Aghanim Scepter became a viable consideration for the late game. The additional damage it provided was solid, but most importantly, as Leshrac hit level 25 and leveled his plus 3 seconds Lightning Storm slow talent, Aghanim Scepter became an incredibly potent tool for disrupting the opponent's movements and stopping them from both initiating and disengaging fights. While Leshrac may not have been popular at TI7, the one team that played him managed to make him work nicely, and they won 4 out of the 5 games they used him in. Still, we should acknowledge the reasons why he wasn't popular. Night Stalker, Batrider and Nyx Assassin were the 3 most contested heroes of the tournament, and they did very well against Leshrac, being able to respectively silence, isolate and mana burn him. 7.0 also had moved the bounty runes away from the mid rune spots and into their own locations. This made playing the mid lane more difficult, as being able to quickly get to the rune spots was important for long-term survivability. Leshrac had no good way of doing so. There were also plenty of other options for the mid lane that could actually win the lane by themselves and were better at being proactive in the early game. If I may add a bit of commentary, I actually think Leshrac could have been a strong safe lane carry, as after he made it past this difficult early game, LGD got a lot of mileage out of him. But at the time, he was considered a mid, and that held him back. I have watched a lot of Dota too. For each story of Dota, I usually spectate around 70 to 80 matches. I have seen lots of games with bad heroes being picked, and the one thing that ties them all together is that even if a bad hero did well, they usually couldn't leverage that into impact on the game. Leshrac at TI7 was nothing like this. After he made it past the laning stage, he was able to participate in fights and push objectives, and he never felt like a burden on his team. Putting weak laners into a safe lane was a perfectly normal approach and was done all the time with heroes like Sven or Anti-Mage. I genuinely believe that the only reason why Leshrac wasn't being picked at TI7 is that TI5 mid Leshrac was so impactful and had burned himself into the mentality of players so strongly that even 2 years later they couldn't let go of it. Overall, Leshrac wasn't a popular pick at TI7, but when he was chosen, he performed well and was clearly a strong hero. Leshrac's legacy already surpassed that of the vast majority of the cast, and he understood that. He was confidently biding his time. He knew that another moment was going to come for him to shine. Patch 7.07 brought another set of new items to Dota 2. Among those was Kaya, the intelligence equivalent to Yasha and Sage. Kaya provided bonus intelligence as well as 10% spell amplification and mana cost and loss reduction. In other words, it made spells deal more damage and cost less mana. This was an ideal item for Leshrac. It fit perfectly into his playstyle. But disappointingly for him, at the time, Kaya didn't have an upgrade, which meant he couldn't actually incorporate it into a late-game item set simply because, while other items were less synergistic, they were more expensive and as a result ultimately more powerful. It is worth keeping in mind though that Kaya was just any upgrade away from being a great item. Also noteworthy were the changes to Bloodstone, which unfortunately no longer included a soul ring in its recipe and instead used the Perseverance. Perseverance was a simple but fairly expensive item that provided bonus health and mana regeneration. Because of the additional cost of the new component, Bloodstone also stopped using a recipe, which kept its overall cost about the same. In addition to this, Bloodstone no longer healed nearby allies when its carrier died. This had never been a major aspect of Bloodstone, but losing it still made the item weaker. More importantly, mana regeneration as a whole was reworked with this patch and gave everybody more mana in the early game. However, the new formula made it more difficult to get very high quantities of mana regeneration, which wasn't a problem for most heroes, but Leshrac needed a lot of mana, and this change made it more difficult to reach the excessive amounts he was looking for. Bottle ferrying was also removed from the game. Couriers couldn't refill bottles anymore, which deleted the strategy. Finally, 7.07 brought perks, which originally gave heroes additional benefits based on their primary attribute, but were then reworked to give everybody benefits based on all of their attributes, with an additional boost for their primary attribute. Strength gave magic resistance, agility movement speed, and intelligence spell amplification. This was a fairly perfect selection for Leshrac, as he greatly appreciated all three. Within this patch period, Leshrac himself also received quite a few changes. His talents were reworked. Plus 5 armor at level 10 was huge, same for plus 30 movement speed or 15 strength at level 15. Even the higher talents were great, plus 50 pulse nova damage pushed an already powerful ability even further, and plus 50 edict explosions let Leshrac completely shred through buildings. Split Earth had its mana cost and cast range reduced. Going from 750 range to 650 may not seem like a big difference, but it was unfortunately just at the breakpoint where Leshrac used to be able to outrange most other cast and attack ranges. This had made interacting with him while he was casting his spells very difficult, and this change now forced him to get close enough that lots of heroes became able to fight back more easily. Lightning Storm saw a similar cast range decrease, going from 800 to 650. However, here this was accompanied with some well-rounded buffs. Among other minor changes, Lightning Storm had its early mana cost reduced and its early damage significantly buffed. This last change returned some of its previous glory to Lightning Storm, as 80 starting damage was the same as it had at TI5, although the ability scaled significantly worse now. Leshrac's stats were also modified. Most noteworthy were another increase to his already incredible movement speed, and finally some fairly significant buffs to his strength, which made him a much more robust hero than he had been. At the International 8, Leshrac returned to Lightning Storm as his primary ability. Its recent damage increase made the spell a viable laning tool again. Leshrac became a strong mid laner, but he ran into a new issue. Due to the recent changes to Bloodstone and the mana regeneration formula, simply rushing Bloodstone wasn't a strong build anymore. It left him vulnerable while he was working towards it, and once he finished the item, it no longer gave him enough mana by itself. To counteract this, players tried a variety of different early game builds, ranging from a fast Yule Scepter of Divinity to Drums of Endurance paired with Ring of Aquila. None of them felt good, They didn't let Leshrac build the momentum he needed. He was suffering from a lack of clarity in direction and identity. This led to some experimentation of playing Leshrac as a support or safe lane carry, but that didn't work well either. His problem wasn't that he was weak. When given the opportunity, Leshrac could still do a ton of damage, and he performed particularly well against illusion-based agility carries like Phantom Lancer and Terrorblade. He also paired excellently with Io, who was one of the top picks of the tournament. Leshrac could have been strong, in theory. In practice, he didn't have a good item build, and that made him too difficult to use to be worth the effort. He only saw play in 5 games, and while he didn't do badly in them, he also felt visibly lacking. A few months after TI8, patch 7.20 released, and with it came the long-awaited upgrades to Kaya. It could be paired with Yasha and Sage to create their respective combination items. In the same patch, Sage lost its main ability and gained status resistance instead. Bloodstone was also significantly reworked. Its build-up remained the same as before, but it lost the pocket deniability and no longer reduced respawn times. In its place, it gained a passive effect that simply doubled mana regeneration. Bloodstone could still gather charges when nearby enemies died, and each charge further increased the health and mana regeneration the item provided. Finally, it gained a new active effect called Blood Pact that transformed 60% of its carrier's current mana into health. This ability had a very long cooldown. While this rework didn't address Bloodstone's difficult item construction, it now provided way more mana regeneration than before, and gained a useful defensive ability. Pocket Deny was a funny effect for sure, but it wasn't actually that good, because Leshrac vastly preferred staying alive over denying himself. These changes made Bloodstone a much more powerful item than it had been over the past year. Another item that was updated was Null Talisman, which now provided 3% spell amplification. This was actually a fairly significant amount considering how cheap of an item Null Talisman was. Additional systemic changes included the addition of consumable Aghanim Scepter and its drop from Roshan, as well as a 0.2 increase to the strength gain of all intelligence heroes, a 15% boost to the primary attribute gain of all heroes, and a 5% increase to the health gain from strength. That's a lot of numbers to say that every single hero in the game became more tanky and had their primary attribute increased. Leshrac himself didn't see many changes. His agility gain was increased, and his movement speed as well as level 25 Diabolic Edict talent were reduced. Only one of his abilities saw adjustments. Diabolic Edict had its damage increased from a maximum of 36 per explosion to 44. This was a fairly significant jump and increased the total damage of the ability from 1440 to 1760, a total boost of 320 damage. Mics, 1, 2, 3. Good. Lights. Good. I think we're ready. Curtains. The International 9 was the Leshrac the Pusher Revival Tour. Diabolic Edict became his most important ability again. Due to its recent buffs, it had become an even more overwhelming pushing ability and was capable of destroying any buildings in seconds. This was incredibly desirable, although for different reasons than it had been in the past. While towers used to be worth killing for their bounty alone, now their importance was more abstract. They opened up farming space, they gave access to valuable map positions, they denied vision. These aspects had always existed, but they were becoming critically important as Dota 2 morphed more towards farming and fighting over map control. Leshrac excelled at both. His farming and pushing tempo were among the best in the game, and due to his high natural movement speed, he had no problem being in the right spot at the right time. If there was a fight going on, Leshrac always either joined it or destroy the tower on the other side of the map. He was ever present for the entire game, starting as early as the drafting stage. Leshrac was a common first pick, largely because of the flexibility he brought. But he was still mainly played in the mid. He was able to fill every single role, and as such, picking him early gave nothing away. Still, his most natural role was either as a mid or a safe lane carry. There he could get all the early experience and farm he needed to start pushing and clearing the jungle. His skill build went back to his old style of Split Earth and Diabolic Edict, although some players liked mixing in early levels of Lightning Storm to get a stronger laning presence. The International 9 had a farming-based metagame, and as a result, there were many games with low kill counts during the first 20 minutes or so of a match. This made it difficult for Leshrac to gather charges on Bloodstone, and so, despite the item's recent buffs, Bloodstone was often delayed or skipped entirely. Instead, players opted for some early no talismans, then a fast use into Kaya into BKB, which maximized Leshrac's fighting power while also giving him significant mana regeneration. With these items, Leshrac had no problem keeping up his mana pool for farming, but during fights, he often ran out. They didn't offer quite enough for sustained post-Nova usage. This became one of his most difficult problems at the tournament, as a Leshrac without mana wasn't a huge threat. However, I don't want to oversell this issue. If a Leshrac managed to use all of his mana in a fight, he most likely did a ton of damage, and anything more was just a bonus. The biggest issue he faced continued to be his lack of defensive options. Leshrac was a huge target. Not only because post-Nova did a ton of damage and Split Earth came out constantly, but also because if Leshrac survived the fight that his team won, then he could punish harder than any other similar hero. Even if Leshrac was the only survivor, he had no problem taking towers and barracks in seconds, particularly after he hit level 25 and got access to his plus 40 Diabolic Edict Explosions talent. Leshrac by himself pushed as fast as an entire team. Because of this, Leshrac was often targeted down as quickly as possible, and whether or not he died determined the outcome of many fights. At the International 2019, Leshrac was a specialist. He excelled at farming and rewarded his team for winning fights like few other heroes could. That's not to say that he was unfairly strong. His laning stage left something to be desired, and he had little he could do against aggressive opponents that didn't give him time to purchase the items he needed. But the slower metagame was favorable for him, as he could often find good opportunities, and his strong AoE also functioned as effective counterpush. The ease with which he slotted into many teams made him the 6th most contested hero of the tournament, with a solid 51% win rate. Leshrac's performance at TI9 was excellent. The king stood on top of the world once again, and he reveled in the spotlight. The International 10 was delayed for a year because of the global pandemic. For the sake of brevity, we're going to focus on only the important changes for these 2 years. Let's start with the larger systemic adjustments. Heroes could now level up to level 30, and by doing so they unlocked both sides of the talent tree. Along the way, they also gained bonus attributes. More scaling was always good for Leshrac, as his fantastic farming speed allowed him to reach those high levels fairly consistently. Neutral items were added, perks were removed. A whole bunch of new items were released. The most important ones were Voodoo Mask, Eternal Shroud and Mage Slayer. Voodoo Mask was a component item that gave a bit of spell lifesteal. More importantly, it introduced spell lifesteal to a wider set of items. Up to this point, it had been restricted exclusively to Octarine core. Leshrac loved the idea of spell lifesteal. He did huge amounts of spell damage and was a big target. Spell lifesteal could have offered him valuable survivability, but until now he had no good way of getting access to it. This is about to change as Voodoo Mask became a component of Bloodstone and Eternal Shroud. Eternal Shroud was a new item that provided magic resistance, health regeneration, and spell lifesteal. It had an active ability that placed a magic damage barrier on its caster that blocked 400 magic damage and turned the block damage into mana. Eternal Shroud was a good fit for Leshrac because it provided sustain and mana. As we already touched on, Bloodstone had its recipe reworked again. It now used a Kaya, a Voodoo Mask, and a Soul Booster. Its stats were then adjusted to include spell lifesteal from Voodoo Mask and the newly acquired attributes from Kaya. Kaya had been reworked to still provide spell amp, but now also mana regen amplification and spell lifesteal amplification. This made it an even more perfect item for Leshrac than it had already been. Mage Slayer was important to Leshrac not because he liked the item, but because it was strong against him, as it was a simple tool that gave its carrier the ability to apply a debuff to opponents they attacked that reduced their spell damage by 35%. Keep this item in mind for later. In patch 7.28, Aghanim's Shard was added. Leshrac's Aghanim's Shard upgraded Split Earth and made it so that after Split Earth was cast, it would automatically recast twice in the same location after a 5-second delay each, and with a slightly increasing radius. Initially, this upgrade wasn't considered great, and so it immediately saw adjustments, increasing the Split Earth echo count from 2 to 3. This made the shard much better, as it essentially turned Split Earth into a 15-second long area denial tool, which was very useful for sieging bases or defending from pushes. 7.29 also added Aghanim's Shard as a Roshan drop from the second Roshan kill, which made Roshan an incredibly high-value target. Leshrac's Aghanim Scepter was also reworked. It now granted him the Nihilism ability. When cast, it provided Leshrac an aura for 4 seconds that turned him and all nearby enemies ethereal. Ethereal units couldn't attack or be attacked. They were also slowed by 30% and took 30% more magic damage. Leshrac himself wasn't slowed and instead gained a 30% movement speed boost, and within 4 days, he also no longer took 30% increased magic damage. This new scepter effect was really strong, as it both protected Leshrac and enabled him to deal more damage. But it needed to be used with care, as it could prevent allies from being able to attack the opposing team. At the same time, it could also stop opponents from attacking. Nihilism was a powerful ability, but it required a bit of attention when using. In particular, it didn't work well with BKB, as gaining magic immunity ended Nihilism. 7.29 added Water Runes, which were a new set of runes that spawned in the power rune locations during the early game. All they did was recover a bit of health and mana, as well as fill up bottles by 2 charges. However, Water Runes spawned in both power rune locations, which returned a lot of consistency into the mid lane. Leshrac wasn't the best at contesting runes because he didn't have a mobility spell, but the Water Runes made it fairly reliable to pick up at least one of them, and as a result all mids had a much easier time to sustain themselves during the early game. On to the specific hero changes. His talents were adjusted to this. Worth pointing out here were the plus 40 Split Earth Radius talent at level 10, which at first glance is fairly unimpressive, but it worked with his Aghanim's Shard, resulting in an overall fairly significant radius increase. You may also notice that Diabolic Edict explosions had been nerfed again. This was part of a bigger nerf to the ability that saw its damage type change from physical to pure. With this change, it also had its damage reduced and lost the 40% bonus damage it dealt to buildings. If you're familiar with Dota, this may sound like a buff, as generally pure damage is much more powerful than physical damage. However, in this particular case, the numbers weren't in Edict's favor. It now dealt significantly less damage to buildings, and it no longer synergized with armor reduction properties. While in certain situations, it could definitely be better now, especially when fighting against heroes. That hasn't ever been its primary use, and as such, this nerf hurt. Lightning Storm saw some minor buffs, and the new talents also helped it a bit. Post Nova had its activation cost at higher levels reduced and its damage buffed. It also received a significant increase in its radius, going from 450 to 525. Finally, Leshrac himself also saw some adjustments. His base strength, strength gain, agility gain and base damage were all increased. If you think back to TI1 Leshrac and his mediocre stat growth, we are long past that now, and at this point Leshrac had some of the best overall attributes in the game. In turn, Leshrac lost 25 attack range, going from 600 to 575. As a mid laner, this actually wasn't unimportant, although his range was still overall fine. Now, finally, after 2 years of nothing, Leshrac was ready to return and be cheered back onto the stage at the International 10. To his disappointment, the venue was not sold out. But by no means did he perform for nobody. His die-hard believers could never let him go. The perception of analysts and players alike was that Leshrac was a powerful mid laner, so that's where he continued to be played. His skill build was variable, although it followed a few rules. Split Earth at level 1 was a given, and usually a second point was also invested into it before level 6. Lightning Storm was commonly skilled at least once during the early laning stage, and it wasn't unusual to see an early second level of it. Both of these abilities were needed for early fighting and laning presence. Ultimate always at level 6, and then Diabolic Edict became the priority, maxed out as early as possible, at the latest by level 10. Edict needed to be leveled up quickly, as one of Leshrac's most important duties was taking down early tier 1 towers to open up farming space and Roshan opportunities. After that, Leshrac usually gained levels so quickly that the order of abilities didn't matter as much anymore. Although it's worth noting that many players opted to skip his level 10 talent entirely and delayed it until they finished leveling his abilities. Even though this skill build was designed to give Leshrac as much leverage for being a strong mid as possible, while not giving up his important early game purpose, it unfortunately wasn't successful. Despite his common perception as a powerful mid, Leshrac frequently lost the lane. Heroes like Viper, Lina or Puck gave him huge trouble. While he excelled at many of the valuable aspects needed for a powerful mid laner, like good damage and range and fast wave clear, he failed at a critical component. Leshrac had very limited opportunities to threaten kills. Even if he won a lane, he couldn't overwhelm it because he couldn't kill his opponent. Only 2 levels each of Lightning Storm and Split Earth simply wasn't enough burst damage. In contrast, because of his lack of defensive options, if he lost a lane, he could be completely destroyed, either getting killed repeatedly or being forced to leave the mid entirely. His performance did not match the community's expectations. Nonetheless, once he made it past the laning stage while not falling too far behind, he could fulfill his team's needs excellently. Tier 1 towers were critically important at the International 10 because Roshan was the most valuable objective on the map. Leshrac was great at both taking down the required towers and then also at securing Roshan. He even got great value out of almost all Roshan rewards, more so than most characters. Aegis and Cheese let him play recklessly, and he had powerful Aghanim Scepter and Shard upgrades. The only one he didn't have much use for was the Refresher Shard, but there was always somebody else on each team that could benefit from its explosive power. Apart from Roshan, TI10 was dominated by a slow, farming-centric metagame, which was both good and bad for Leshrac. He remained one of the fastest farming heroes in Dota, but he didn't have a good item build to spend that money on. Surprisingly, Bloodstone created more problems than it offered synergy. The recent inclusion of Kaya into its recipe was actually more downside than upside because it restricted Leshrac from building the incredible Sane Kaya, as Kaya effects couldn't be stacked. Bloodstone's active healing effect also went against Leshrac's interests, as it used a large portion of his precious mana. It made him choose between staying alive and dealing damage. To top it all off, due to the farming-centric nature of the meta, there were few opportunities for Leshrac to actually build up the Bloodstone stacks that were needed to turn the item into the infinite source of mana that he wanted it to be. Despite all of these issues, Bloodstone was still one of the most popular items on the hero. This was not a sign of Bloodstone's strength, but an indicator of Leshrac's lack of options. He tried to make do with Arcane Boots, Yours and BKB before Bloodstone, but this left him vulnerable to high burst damage and wasn't enough to sustain his mana pool in extended fights. Various other ideas like early Hood of Defiance into Eternal Shroud or Saint Kaya instead of Bloodstone were tried, but had limited success. The International 10 was meant to be another year of dominance for the king, but instead, he was doomed to a fate most cruel. No, he wasn't bad. Worse. He was mediocre. Unremarkable. Contested in only 55 games, he saw himself in the middle of the pack, and there he failed with an awful 34% win rate. While at first he still saw play, he only became less popular as the tournament continued. If PSG LGD hadn't been his most ardent followers, by the end of it, he would have vanished entirely. No greater insult had ever hit the star of Dota. Filled with despair, Leshrac turned to his father and prayed, "I am strong. Give me the tools. I deserve them." And from above, the frog reached down and replied, "Here, my son, I made this just for you." After the International 10, a set of new items were released into Dota 2. The most important of the bunch was easily Wraith Pact. Wraith Pact was a short-lived item that was built out of a Vladimir's offering and a point booster. It provided the combined stats and had an active component that allowed it to summon a Wraith Pact totem. The Wraith Pact totem applied a debuff to nearby opponents that reduced all damage they dealt by 30% and also did 30 damage per second. All damage really meant all damage, which included all attacks and spells. The totem could be destroyed in 4 hits. Wraith Pact was tremendously powerful and became a mainstay item at TI11, as it was bought on nearly every team in nearly every match. Leshrac himself was buffed in a variety of ways. His base damage was increased and then increased again. His strength gain was also further elevated. Then Lightning Storm had its number of targets increased by 1. This may seem like a minor improvement, but it changed the ability so that Leshrac no longer needed a second point into it for Lightning Storm to have enough bounces to hit all creeps of an early creep wave and the opposing hero. Lightning Storm became a much more powerful laning tool and even had its early damage adjusted downwards to stay reasonable. Nihilism also saw a boost to its usability, as it no longer ended should Leshrac become magic immune. The only nerf Leshrac received during this period was another decrease to his level 25 Edict talent. Various old items saw adjustments, but the most important changes came to Bloodstone. Bloodstone was reworked and now only used a Voodoo Mask, Soul Booster and 900 gold for its recipe, costing 1,150 less gold than it did before. Despite the lower cost, it still had the bonus health, mana and spell lifesteal it provided buffed. The stack properties of it were removed entirely, and its active component was reworked from scratch. The new Blood Pact had its users sacrifice 10% of their current health to gain a powerful buff for the next 6 seconds. During this period, the spell lifesteal Bloodstone provided was doubled to 50% and now restored an equal amount of mana alongside health. In the following patches, the item was made even more powerful, giving more spell lifesteal on a lower cooldown for a cheaper price. A more perfect item could not have been made for Leshrac. It was everything he had needed. But he wasn't going to take any more chances. He was going to stand on top no matter what. Pulse Nova had always been mana intensive. Patch 7.32 changed how the mana cost worked. Pulse Nova no longer started draining mana as soon as it was activated, but 1 second afterwards. The initial mana cost stayed the same. Pulse Nova still needed 70 mana to be activated. This change was meant to lower the mana required for short-term post-nova activations. But Leshrac took this unassuming buff and used it for what it was: an opportunity to break the rules. In October 2022, Leshrac made the Dota scene dance to his whim. He returned to his roots and played the tune that had once made him king. Leshrac took dominion over the mid lane once again. Even using the recently buffed Lightning Storm, his early laning presence still left something to be desired. But that wasn't as important anymore, as Dota solidified itself as a game about farming and mid-game fights. While Leshrac wasn't able to guarantee winning his lane, he never lost it badly because Lightning Storm and Split Earth allowed him to keep a safe distance while guaranteeing last hits. And as soon as he hit level 6, he could easily clear large jungle stacks with Post-Nova, which allowed him to rapidly gather enough gold to purchase that which was most important: Bloodstone. It had been a few years, but finally, Bloodstone returned as a must-rush, must-buy item that allowed Leshrac to do anything he desired. It gave healing, it gave mana, it gave stats, it was affordable, it had a good build-up. It was perfect. A 15-minute Bloodstone was an expected timing, and as soon as Leshrac had it, he became able to roam the map freely, farming and fighting endlessly as he spammed Blood Pack to refresh his health and mana at no cost. The effect only had a 30-second cooldown, so there was no reason to not activate it to farm a creep wave, which then recovered all of the mana that was consumed and extra. Blood Pack was also overwhelmingly powerful in fights, as a single tick of Post-Nova could bring Leshrac from near death with no mana to a fully recovered state in seconds. Post-Nova's newly reduced mana cost also allowed Leshrac to employ a trick that had existed all along, but had only now become worth using. Activating Post-Nova instantly dealt damage to all nearby enemies, and then it did its damage again once every second. However, Post-Nova had no cooldown and could be deactivated and activated again at will. If Leshrac used Post-Nova, then waited exactly 1 second for the first tick of the damage to hit, then instantly turned it off and then on again, he was able to deal 50% more damage than he was supposed to. This trick used more mana than just running the ability normally did, because Leshrac had to pay the activation cost over and over again. But often that was fine, as more damage also meant more mana recovery from Bloodstone. It can be hard to decipher when this trick was being used. The tell is Leshrac swinging his arm out and in repeatedly, which is the casting animation for Post-Nova. As much as this trick enhanced Leshrac's power, it did also come with the risk of getting disabled while Post-Nova was turned off, which could potentially severely limit his actual damage in a fight. Most players opted to only use the trick when it was safe to do so, but nonetheless, it presented an option for Leshrac to supercharge his damage output whenever desired. Leshrac was used by nearly every team at the international 11, but one group of players relied on him more than anyone else. Let's have a closer look at Game 1 between Thunder Awaken and Team Secret during the upper bracket semi-finals to see how the king performed on the biggest stage Dota 2 has to offer. Nisha plays Leshrac in the mid, going up against Mars. Right away, he starts throwing out spells aggressively, which lets him secure enough last hits to afford a quick bottle. With the bottle, he can continue sustaining himself in lane, especially with the additional resources the water runes provide. Even that isn't enough to win the lane though. Leshrac quickly falls behind on last hits and denies, and finds himself playing defensively. But the overall metagame of TI11 plays in his favor here. While during previous years he would have had to worry about getting ganked, in this tournament the early game was often very passive, as the strict nature of the lanes didn't leave many openings for supports to rotate. Because of this, Nisha is given the space he needs to catch up. He purchases arcane boots and then focuses on a simple farming rotation between the mid lane and the jungle. Push out the mid, then clear jungle camp that was stacked for him by his support, push out the mid again, and repeat. Leshrac's strong AoEs and high natural movement speed allow him to maintain a brisk tempo while farming this way, and he quickly takes over as the top net worth in the game. To enable this, he invested his first skill points into Split Earth and Lightning Storm, but as he reaches level 10, Diabolic Edict is still the primary ability he maxes out. The positioning opportunities provided by taking tier 1 towers were considered hugely valuable, so Nisha starts grouping up with his team to take those towers using Edict. Thunder Awaken put in effort to defend, but as the Morphling is currently focused on farming, they're not able to hold on for too long, and Team Secret managed to secure the mid and top tier 1 towers. Through this, Leshrac acquired enough gold for his Bloodstone, but has fallen behind compared to Morphling, as he hasn't been able to focus on farming as much. However, with the Bloodstone in hand, this worries him not. Blood Pact only had a 30-second cooldown. He could spam it while farming to maintain a permanently refreshed mana pool while also never dropping below full health. When he first shows off his new tool in a fight, Secret overwhelms Tundra easily, and Nisha leaves the fight in a fully recovered state despite taking significant damage from Freezing Field. A bit of farming follows, then it's time for Roshan. Since Roshan is only a single huge target, Diabolic Edict was a fantastic way of dealing damage to him. Here the recent change into pure damage also played into Leshrac's favor, as Roshan had very high resistances that Edict now bypassed. Using their high damage, the Radiant team secretly steals Roshan away. Leshrac takes the edges and then finishes BKB. His natural damage is so high that he can focus his item build entirely on defense. When a big fight starts in the dire jungle, Nisha simply walks into the middle of it, tanking attacks from Morphling without an issue, as BKB protects him from spells and Bloodstone constantly restores both his health and mana and keeps him in fighting shape as he deals tremendous damage spamming his spells. The Aegis would have protected him from death, but he wasn't killable in the first place, which shows again in the next fight.
Get Renzo first off, they're going to get the spear immediately afterwards. This time around, they chain stun him down. Zion trying to get on top of Matthew. At the same time, look for Chrysalis as well. He's playing the back line. Looks like he's getting out of there, but Nisha's going in there with his Bloodstone and his Aegis. He's ready to fight. He's ready to bring down the Mars. The spear goes up. The last bit of damage isn't quite there. Meanwhile, they're playing away from Nisha at all costs. Everybody else running away from the Leshrac and killing anybody else they can get their hands on. Now with a buyback coming out from the Snapfire, they can try and go again here. See if they can kill Nisha twice. Chrysalis might be needed to help out. A roll in, immediately silenced. Pops him into, but it's too much. Because gets bursted down. He didn't expect that one. The spear goes out. Getting him low, but without the Morphling, now they've lost so much of their...
Nisha is ruling this game. To push his advantage even further, he now opts for aggressive utility. Blink Dagger and Boots of Travel, both of which also double as farming items. Leshrac continues leading his team, allowing them to push their advantage and build a monetary lead as well as solidify their map control. As a result, Team Secret freely takes the second Roshan. Nisha's item build up to this point has been the standard path that most Leshrac players went for. However, from here the hero had various options available to him, each suited to different situations. Shiva's Guard was a great defensive item that worked best against high physical damage teams, and Kaya and Sage provided both offensive power as well as additional health and healing. Aghanim's Shard, Aghanim's Scepter and Eul's were also strong options for the right situations, but the ultimate goal was always Scythe of Wise, which could be used to instantly hex an opponent into a harmless animal that was unable to do anything but move. With this item, Leshrac could initiate fights without fear, as a quick blink into a hex set up for an easy follow-up and enormous burst damage, while BKB and Bloodstone kept him alive and enabled him to play recklessly. As soon as Nisha finishes the item, he jumps Morphling and annihilates him, giving his team an opportunity to take the first mid base tower. Team Secret now has a significant lead and Leshrac is on top of it all. From here, it's just a matter of taking what he earned.
They're going to find that ward? Oh, no, they're not. They're going to get initiated on first. Nisha, not even bothering to blow the BKB. He knows this is an initiation that Thunder cannot follow up on. But Rezo jumping in, Blink Dagger immediately goes for the grab. Panda move's gonna be first. They still have the rolling out on Sacred. He needs to be able to jump away. They manage to get the Hex of the Morphling with the ball of Suns, and they're chaining him down. That is just a dead Morphling. Dark Mago did what he could to stop Crystallis's damage, but ultimately it's the Leshrac who wins the fight. And now they will chase down for as many heroes as possible. Rezo getting up and under that Snapfire. Triple kill for Crystallis. Add another one on the mix. Panda Moo roasted by Nisha in the Fire and Flames.
Cause wasn't expecting that Hex to be that low of cooldown. Yeah. He jumped Hex the guy, they kill him, and then he basically got Blink Hexed again.
Dark Mago chasing after them, but he's got to be careful. Doesn't want to overextend. They have the buyback. Secret's coming back in, but Dark Mago's already dead. Rolling Thunder on up. They cannot let Team Secret walk away with this. Because is coming back. He's TPing in. They wanted to keep going, but now Nisha seeing them on the retreat with the Rolling Thunder on cooldown. There's the Hex. Resolution also catching that Snapfire. Sacred is still alive. Never mind. Rezo grabs him, tosses him back in. There's no chance of Megas. Secret will just take that second lane of Barons.
Anything and everything.
Nisha goes in, blind blink in, goes to the site, immediately finds the Pingo. A huge opportunity. 2 dead already.
One ward gets placed, one hero gets spotted.
Ooh, the waveform charges. The Kaz jumps in, jumps out. Dark Mago pops his BKB. They get a decent initiation with the Crystal Maiden. On top of that, thanks to the Sapphire, they're doing lots of damage. The BKBs, though, are allowing them to persevere. Because turning into the Drow Ranger has to keep his distance from Resolution. The bashes are too much. He needs to get on top of the Drow Ranger, but he turns into Zone Form. Zayas saving the Drow, kicks him across. Because on the hunt has to waveform forward. He desperately wants to kill for the Manta Dodge. Another hit miss. Now the sight. Now they're turning around, and there it is. Because gets blown up, and immediately the GG is called. Team Secret will take game 1 in this upper bracket match.
Team Secret loved Leshrac. They used him frequently and won nearly every game they played with the hero. They were also one of the few teams to use Leshrac in other lanes. Specifically, they favored him in the offlane, paired with a powerful aggressive support like Marcy or Earth Spirit. Over the past years, the offlane had changed to no longer be abandoned territory, and instead offlane players often had the high expectation of shutting down the opponent's main carry placed on them. Leshrac was able to apply a ton of pressure with his powerful disables and then easily transition into the farming powerhouse his team needed him to be. Team Secret stood with the king, and on the back of his strength, they made their way through the tournament. In another corner of the bracket, Team Tundra was refusing the hype. They banned Leshrac, they let him be banned, but they never played with or against him, and as they met Team Secret in the upper bracket finals, they continued to deny his presence, banning him for all 3 games before taking the victory and waiting for Team Secret to meet them again. As the 2 teams clashed in the grand finals, Tundra revealed that not only did they not fear the king, but also that they had no reason to. In all 3 games of the grand finals, Tundra let Secret have Leshrac, and every time they countered him into irrelevance. In game 1, Tundra bought Wraith Pact, Pipe of Insight and Mage Slayer on their Tidehunter, who then clung to Leshrac and shut him down with an overwhelming amount of damage reduction. For Bloodstone to heal Leshrac and to restore his mana, he needed to do damage, but with all of these reductions, he couldn't. For game 2, Tundra brought out the Wraith Pact and Mage Slayer again, but also layered Arc Warden's Aghanim Shard effect on top of that, which provided 40% magic resistance to teammates inside of Magnetic Field. They waited carefully until they saw where Leshrac was attacking, and then negated his damage and killed him. Finally, in Game 3, they purchased Mage Slayer again, but also built their team in such a way that Leshrac couldn't close the distance. Pangolier and Tiny kept him away, while Medusa tore him to pieces. Tundra not only defeated Leshrac 3 times in a row to win the entire tournament, but they made it look easy. At the International 11, Leshrac stood on top of the world once again. Valve had played favorites and reworked Bloodstone in such a way that it was the perfect item for him, and only him. It fixed every long-standing issue the hero had, solving both his mana and survivability problems. This alone would have been enough to push Leshrac into the top tier of heroes, but he needed more. He had spent so much time in the sun that the night started to scare him. abusing an unintended interaction that was removed shortly after the tournament, Leshrac pushed his damage output to new heights. The only thing that could stop him was the best team of the tournament. Leshrac was contested in an incredible 149 games with a staggering 57% win rate, vastly surpassing the few heroes more popular than him. His performance was again once in a lifetime for any other hero, but for Leshrac, it was just another tournament. Leshrac started his journey in Dota 2 as a humble support whose primary job was to land a stun and protect his team. But Leshrac was always more than that. Within only a year, his natural pushing talents carried him to the top of the meta. Leshrac's powerful role compression and flexibility were more akin to modern Dota heroes than anything else that existed at the time. He dominated TI2 as a support, but also got to experience core positions for the first time. And he liked them. Leshrac continued honing his craft over the next 2 years as he took on a minor role in the competitive scene. While his pick rate wasn't high, his performance, when played by teams that embraced his eccentric strengths, remained impressive. Then in 2015, Leshrac showed off the buffs he had gathered, took over the mid lane, and became the undeniably strongest hero in the game. He was unstoppable as he crushed the mid lane with ease, then ganked and roamed aggressively before smoothly transitioning into a powerful late-game carry role. There was no hero that fought stronger, farmed faster, or used opportunities better. Leshrac became king. After TI5 came to a close, Leshrac was hit with heavy nerfs, and he took a well-deserved break from the competitive scene. Only a few dared to ask him to perform anyways, and like a true professional, Leshrac proved that even at his weakest, he was not to be trifled with. His tournament performance, although sparse, remained impactful. During this era, it became clear that Leshrac wasn't going to leave the mid lane again. His impact as a mid at the International 5 was so momentous that for the next 8 years, competitors could see him nowhere else. Once he had grasped the leading role, he couldn't let go. At the International 9, Leshrac returned as the most important solo artist in Dota 2, taking strong inspiration from his roots by focusing his attention on being one of the most dangerous pushers in the game. The story of Leshrac was also the story of Bloodstone. It had been his trusted companion for many years, but as time passed, it lost a lot of what had made it so appealing. Despite that, Leshrac had few other options. His mana needs were so high that he had to make concessions. This had worked for him for a long time, but at TI10, Leshrac and his Bloodstone reached a collective low point that he couldn't accept. Bloodstone was then reworked to be a dream come true, and Leshrac himself went the extra, unusual mile to assure that he got to continue to keep the audience's eyes only on himself. Only a minority of heroes can claim to have been a top pick at an international. Even fewer earned this right twice. Leshrac did it 4 times and maintained a stellar win rate throughout. When Leshrac was bad, he was better than most. When he was good, he was the best in the game. Despite already being the 5th most contested hero of all time, Leshrac should probably have seen even more play than he did. Leshrac was inarguably one of the strongest Dota heroes of all time, and he might be the one to ultimately sit on the throne. A legend through and through that has rightfully earned his place among the stars. Thank you very much for watching the video. We very much appreciate it. Sorry that I wasn't on camera today, but I've got a little thing on my face that's annoying. So just decided to go with this for today. I hope that's all right. I told Tosuke to just kind of figure out what to do about it. So I'm very curious to see what's gonna be. Because I won't know, because there isn't really enough time to check. So yeah, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed the Leshrac video. If I'm completely honest, this is my favorite by a pretty long shot. I really enjoyed making this video because I think it was a video where we went a bit more creatively with it, right? As you can see, we incorporated a bit of a storyline that isn't just strictly speaking, here is what happened with the hero. And I think that made it all quite a bit more fun. So I hope you guys enjoyed that as well. The future videos will be similar. At least we'll try to keep them interesting in the same way. Next up is Sniper. So I hope you guys are looking forward to that. That's going to be next. Now, one thing I want to mention is we've got the International 2023 coming up soon. And I imagine you guys will expect that the upcoming videos will include the International 2023. And while that will be true, we will include it as soon as possible. The video after Sniper and the video after that will not include the International 2023 because they will be written before the International 2023 finishes, and as such, having to go back entirely to rewrite them and add a whole new section would just be extremely difficult to fit into the schedule. So just so you know, just so you manage your expectations there. Anyway, I guess that's that. So I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you soon.